The story begins in the last days of a summer that stank of dust and incense, when the palace corridors whispered with conspiracies and the throne of the empire trembled. Beneath the weight of a crown that had passed through too many bloodied hands, it was here, in the shadow of a dying dynasty, that a man not born to rule found himself seated upon the ancient seat of emperors. His name suddenly inked into the chronicles of power, yet destined to be erased almost as soon as it was written, for fate had allotted him not years nor even months, but a reign that would burn like a candle in the wind. 7 days of absolute command over millions, and then silence. This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels, for the empire into which our brief sovereign was thrust had been splintered by decades of rot. Not the rot of the body, but the rot of institutions, armies loyal to rival generals, provinces fattened by their own greed and starved of loyalty to the capital, a treasury that jingled with coin no longer worth the metal it was struck from, and courtiers whose smiles masked blades. In this crucible, the new emperor was both pawn and player, a figure whose life had been a tapestry of obscurity until the sudden death, or was it murder, of the sovereign before him cracked the gates of destiny open just enough for him to slip through. He had been a provincial governor, respected for his stern justice and feared for his ability to read the ambitions of men, as if they were written across their faces. But he had never commanded the armies, never shaped the empires. Foreign policy never stood beneath the crushing weight of the jeweled diadem whose cold gold could crush the skull as surely as a mace. Yet on that morning, as the city's bells tolled low and the sun burned pale through a sky heavy with storm, he was led into the Hall of Radiance, where the regalia of state lay upon a slab of obsidian, and he took them not with triumph, but with the wary gaze of a man who knows the crown is both a gift and a curse. The courtiers bowed, the scribes recorded his oaths, and in the streets below, the people murmured, some with hope, some with fear, for in a land where each succession was a gamble, no one knew whether this new emperor would be savior, tyrant, or the next body to be borne out through the bronze gates and left for the carrion birds beyond. The city walls day one of his reign began not with feasts or proclamations, but with a slow grinding of the imperial machine turning to test the weight of its new occupant. Before dawn had fully lifted the haze from the marble courtyards, the chamberlain's voice was already echoing through the Hall of Seals, reciting petitions and crises in the same unbroken cadence, as though the death of the previous emperor had been but a minor rearrangement of chairs. Yet beneath the ceremonial calm, the empire was a cauldron at full boil, and the new sovereign could feel the heat through the soles of his sandals. From the north came word of a frontier garrison refusing orders, holding its fortress in the name of a distant cousin of the royal bloodline, while in the eastern provinces, merchants threatened to withhold grain unless their tax exemptions, revoked by the last ruler, were restored. The imperial treasury, once the pride of the realm, lay almost empty, its coffers filled with debased silver, an ios written in a dead man's hand, and the palace guard, who should have been the shield of the throne, was split between loyalty to the commander of the city watch and the marshal of the southern legions, two men who had not spoken without shouting since a duel 30 years past, had ended in blood and humiliation. And so, on his very first morning, the emperor found himself less a ruler than a negotiator walking a bridge of glass over a chasm of knives. Each step calculated, each word weighed. He sat upon the lion throne, its golden armrests worn smooth by centuries of hands, and listened to the endless parade of advisors whose counsel was laced with self-interest, their faces painted in the serene mass of loyal servants even as their eyes darted like those of hawks sizing prey. The emperor's mind, trained in the quiet governance of a province, now had to grasp the labyrinth of imperial politics, where every decision was a test of strength and every hesitation a sin of weakness that predators would seize. And as the day wore toward its blood-red sunset, the first messenger arrived from the western coast, a rider whose horse collapsed dead at the palace gates, bringing a letter sealed in black wax, a letter that would make the emperor's hands tighten around the armrest until the gold dinted beneath his grip. For it was not a greeting of loyalty, but a warning: leave the throne while you still breathe, or you will be carried from it with your eyes open and your tongue cut out. Night fell like a drawn blade over the capital, and the palace, that vast, coiled beast of stone and shadow, seemed to hold its breath, for whispers moved faster in darkness than in daylight, and the new emperor had already learned that in this city, a rumor could gallop ahead of a decree and crush it beneath its hooves. The black wax letter lay upon his table, its words etched into his mind with the precision of a dagger point. Yet he gave no outward sign of fear, for fear was a scent as dangerous as blood in a shark-filled sea. And so he summoned the captain of his personal guard, a grizzled veteran whose loyalty was measured not in oaths but in scars, and ordered that the palace gates be barred from the inside and the watch doubled at every entrance. Still, he knew walls could be scaled, bribes slipped through keyholes, and knives drawn in chambers thought secure. So he called for the Keeper of the Night, an official whose title was older than the empire itself, master of the labyrinthine network of spies, informants, and black-hooded agents who traded secrets like coin. This man, thin as a shadow and dressed in robes the color of old ink, entered the room without sound, and the emperor spoke to him not as a ruler giving orders, but as one gambler to another across a table where the stakes were life itself, telling him to find the source of the threat before the next moonrise. Yet even as these precautions were set in motion, the court was already shifting beneath him. Like sand under a rising tide, factions aligning, ambassadors whispering in galleries, servants carrying tidings from the kitchens to the council chambers, and somewhere within that shifting maze, the author of the black wax letter waited, patient as a spider, knowing that the reign of a man with enemies he could not yet see was a reign already half broken. And as the emperor stood on his balcony, looking out over the city lights flickering like embers in the wind, he felt a truth settle in his bones. The crown had been placed upon his head, not to honor him, but to lure him into the center of the hunt. Out the dawn of the second day arrived without the peace that usually comes with sunlight. For the capital awoke not to hymns of loyalty, but to the pounding of fists on the bronze doors of the Hall of Judgments, where the empire's ministers assembled in their embroidered robes like a flock of brightly colored vultures. The emperor entered that hall not as a guest, but as prey in their eyes, and the murmurs rippling through the marble chamber told him all he needed to know. The letter's threat had already seeped into the bloodstream of the court, though no one dared name it aloud. The minister of coin, a narrow-eyed man whose family controlled the mint, was the first to step forward, presenting a petition on behalf of the merchant guilds demanding immediate tax forgiveness and control over the grain fleets, a move that would starve the treasury and bind the throne to the whims of private wealth. And when the emperor, with measured calm, refused, the minister bowed deeply, a gesture less of respect than of theatrical martyrdom, and withdrew, murmuring to his allies. Then came the marshal of the southern legions, his polished armor catching the sun like a blade, offering to march his troops north to crush the rebellious garrison, but only if granted extraordinary powers over all military appointments, a concession that would make him a king in all but name. Again, the emperor declined, knowing that a single misstep here would unravel what little authority he possessed. And again, the refusal was met with smiles that did not reach the eyes. By midday, the hall was thick with the scent of incense and hidden malice, the air so heavy with veiled challenges that even the scribes scratched their quills slower, afraid to draw too much attention to any name they recorded. But it was in the late session, as the sun slanted low and painted the hall in blood-colored light, that the true challenge came. The Keeper of the Night entered, unbidden, and in his hand he carried not a report, but a severed ring finger, still bearing the signet of a noble house, the flesh pale, the gold band slick with dried blood. Placing it silently at the emperor's feet, he spoke only 7 words. "This is the first who would serve you." The finger lay upon the marble like a relic from some darker rite, its gold signet glinting in the slanting light, and though the assembled ministers recoiled in performative horror, the emperor saw in their eyes something colder than fear, calculation, the kind that weighs how quickly blood can become opportunity. He recognized the ring at once, for it belonged to Lord Virelius, a baron of the western marches whose estates bordered the turbulent frontier, and whose loyalty had always been as mercurial as the tides. Yet the keeper of the night had brought it here without explanation, forcing the emperor to address it in public, under the watch of eyes that fed on every flicker of his expression. He did not kneel to inspect it, nor did he dismiss it as an irrelevance. Instead, he ordered it, placed upon the great obsidian table before him, where it caught the gaze of all present, a silent witness to the fact that the unseen war had already claimed its first prize. The keeper's meaning was clear enough to a man trained in the subtler dialects of power. Someone had acted in the emperor's name without his command, striking down a potential rival not with open battle, but with an assassin's art, and, in doing so, had bound themselves to him in blood or sought to implicate him in a crime whose shadow would stain his 7 days. Whether it was loyalty, manipulation, or both, the emperor could not yet tell. But he knew this much: the game had shifted, and he was no longer merely a ruler resisting demands, but a man whose throne now stood upon a foundation of corpses. That night, as the palace torches guttered in the wind, he summoned the keeper in private and asked only one question: not who had killed Lord Virelius, but why the killer had chosen this moment to act. And the keeper, with the faintest smile, replied, "Because, my emperor, your enemies were waiting to see if you had the stomach to spill blood. Now they know." Day 3 began with the sound of hoofbeats hammering through the palace gates, a messenger arriving before the sun had cleared the city walls, his cloak torn by thorns and his eyes wide with the knowledge that what he carried would change. The air in the throne room, the death of Lord Virelius, barely a whisper in the capital the night before, had become a thunderclap in the western marches. His retainers had seized the fortified town of Dravensport, closed its gates to imperial envoys, and sent riders to rally the coastal barons into a block of defiance, framing the assassination not as the act of an unknown blade, but as a direct order from the emperor himself. The claim spread like fire through dry grass, for it was easy to believe, too easy, given the emperor's refusal to yield to their demands in his first days. And while no proof was offered, none was needed in a realm where rumor could be as fatal as steel. At council that morning, the minister of coin argued that the revolt should be met with negotiation, offering amnesty in exchange for tribute, while the marshal of the southern legions pressed for an immediate siege to crush the western defiance before it could root itself in allied ports. The two men clashed so bitterly that their voices rose over the courtiers' murmurs, and the emperor, listening in stillness, understood that the assassination had not merely removed one man. It had forced every ambitious player to take a side, and in taking sides, to reveal themselves. But even as he weighed the choice between steel and silver, the keeper of the night entered with a new report, written in a hand the emperor recognized from his days as a provincial governor. A secret ally, once thought long dead, now offering not only support, but ships and soldiers to secure the West, if, and only if, the emperor would promise to make him heir. It was a bargain offered in whispers, yet in its shadow loomed the oldest danger of the throne, that the crown might survive the crisis, but the man beneath it would not. The council dispersed under the guise of adjournment, though in truth it was retreat, each minister vanishing into the corridors to scheme in private, and the emperor remained alone in the Hall of Radiance, its vast windows spilling white light across the mosaic floor, where generations of rulers had paced in moments of decision. The offer from his resurrected ally lay before him, the parchment rough beneath his fingertips, the ink still faintly smelling of salt and tar. And he knew that accepting it would be an unbreakable chain, for to name an heir not of the reigning bloodline was to declare a break with centuries of dynastic law, a provocation that would unite enemies who otherwise despised each other. Yet rejecting it meant facing the Western revolt without the naval power and hardened troops that only this man could provide, soldiers seasoned by years of border war, men who could march into Travansport's gates before the city's allies even assembled. In that long moment, the emperor recalled his years as governor, when he had learned that survival was not always about choosing the right path, but the one whose consequences you could endure. And so he summoned the Keeper of the Night, dictating, in a voice as steady as stone, the words that would bind him. The ally would be named there in a private codex, sealed and hidden from public record until the emperor's death, in exchange for immediate military aid against the West. The Keeper's eyes flickered with something between approval and pity, for he knew that such secrets, once written, had a way of surfacing not in the intended hour, but in the moment most fatal to their author. By dusk, fast ships were already cutting through the harbor's gray waters, bearing orders to rally the air's forces, and the emperor stood upon the balcony watching them vanish into the horizon, aware that with that single decision he had set the board for the remaining days of his reign. And somewhere, unseen, the spider who had woven the black wax warning was tugging at new threads, smiling at how willingly the fly had stepped deeper into the web. By the fourth morning, the city itself had begun to turn restless, its markets humming with a tension that no decree could quiet, for word, or something like it, had begun to leak from the palace, carried not by heralds but by fishmongers, bakers, and the boys who ran errands between noble houses. The gossip was shapeless, a blur of truth and invention. Yet all versions carried the same poison seed, that the emperor had promised the throne to a man, not of the royal blood, a foreigner in all but name, whose ships now approached the capital under cover of loyalty. In the marble courtyards, servants lingered longer than their duties required, straining to overhear council meetings, while in the wine shops along the harbor, the dockside captains were already wagering on how long the new emperor would last. Within the palace itself, the marshal of the southern legions grew suddenly attentive to the comings and goings of the harbor quarter, posting his own men among the watch and intercepting messages meant for the Keeper of the Night, while the minister of coin, always the first to scent a change in fortune, began quietly transferring his family's wealth to strongholds beyond the capital walls. The emperor, reading these shifts like the tilt of a battlefield, understood that the promise he had made in secrecy had already become an open blade, one that his enemies would twist until it severed the fragile thread of legitimacy he still held. Yet he could not retract it without shattering the alliance he needed to crush the Western revolt, and so he doubled the guard at the palace gates, ordered the silversmiths to mint new coin bearing his likeness, and summoned the city's guildmasters to a private audience, intending to buy their silence with privileges and trade concessions. But even as he spoke to them, he saw in their eyes the gleam of men calculating whether the emperor before them would be in power long enough to make the bargain worth keeping. And he knew then that his reign was no longer a matter of policy, but of survival measured in days, perhaps fewer than the 7 fate had allotted him. The first sight of the heir's fleet came at sunset, when the horizon turned to molten copper and the sea itself seemed to breathe in long, rolling swells, carrying with it the dark silhouettes of warships that moved not like merchants, but like predators. From the palace's seaward balconies, the emperor watched their approach, his eyes tracing the lines of the ships, lean, high-prowed vessels built for speed and ramming, their oars cutting the water in perfect rhythm, sails furled to keep their arrival slow and deliberate, a show of control rather than haste. At their head flew no imperial standard, but the heir's personal banner, a black field broken by a single silver crown, tilted as if falling, And though the emperor had expected this mark of independence, he felt a knot tighten in his chest at how boldly it declared ownership of the moment. By nightfall, the fleet was anchored in the outer harbor, its crews silent, campfires winking on the decks like watchful eyes. And in the streets below, the people gathered in uneasy knots, their murmurs carrying upward in a low, restless tide. The marshal of the southern legions requested an immediate audience, his tone stiff with the formality that masked hostility, warning that no foreign force, allied or not, should be allowed to berth so close to the capital without submitting to imperial inspection. The emperor, aware that refusing the fleet entry would shatter his bargain before a single soldier disembarked, ordered the harbor gates open at dawn, knowing it would feed the whispers already gnawing at his legitimacy. Yet as he dismissed the marshal, the keeper of the night emerged from the shadows with a slip of parchment, bearing only 8 words in a hand the emperor did not recognize. The crown you promised will not be yours to give. Dawn came with a brittle stillness, the harbor shrouded in mist that clung to the water like breath on glass, and from its pale veil the air's flagship emerged, sliding toward the docks with the slow confidence of a predator already certain of its prey. The emperor stood at the edge of the royal pier, flanked by the palace guard in their polished cuirasses, each man's hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, not in open threat, but in the silent readiness of those who know they may be called to spill blood before the sun sets. The heir descended the gangplank without haste, a tall figure in a cloak lined with wolf fur despite the summer heat, his face weathered by years of salt wind and war, his eyes the pale gray of winter seas, the kind of gaze that takes the measure of a man not by his crown but by the strength in his stance. When they clasped forearms in the ritual greeting of the old warrior kings, it was with the force of 2 men testing each other's bones, and the emperor felt in that grip both the weight of promised aid and the shadow of a claim that might yet grow teeth. Their exchange of words was brief, formal, almost polite, yet every syllable was a move in an unspoken duel, the heir speaking as though the alliance were an act of mutual salvation, the emperor replying as though it were a transaction sealed and done, neither giving ground in tone or posture. By midday, the heir's troops had begun to disembark, their boots drumming on the planks, their banners unfurled beside the imperial standard in a show of unity that was already being read in the taverns and marketplaces as a sign of division, and in the high windows of the palace, unseen but not unseeing. The marshal of the southern legions watched with narrowed eyes, while somewhere in the twisting lanes of the harbor quarter, a runner carried a sealed letter bearing the same black wax that had warned the emperor on his first day, a letter addressed not to the throne, but to the heir. The letter reached the heir in the quiet hour before dusk, when the camp outside the harbor was settling into the low murmur of men sharpening blades, mending armor, and drinking away the taste of salt from the voyage. It was delivered by a hooded courier whose presence barely stirred the guards, as though the exchange had been anticipated, perhaps even arranged. And though the wax bore the same black seal that had haunted the emperor's first night on the throne, the heir did not break it immediately. Instead, he turned it in his hands, studying the imprint like a chess player contemplating the opening move of a long game. When at last the seal cracked beneath his thumb, the contents were short enough to be read in a single breath. Yet whatever they said made his mouth curve in the faintest, most dangerous smile, the kind a man wears when the game has just tilted in his favor. The emperor did not hear the letter until the keeper of the night brought him word that same evening, appearing in the throne room as though he had stepped out of the air itself, his tone low, and even as he recounted how the heir's demeanor had shifted, how he had spent the remainder of the day not with his officers, but in the company of certain merchants from the west, men whose loyalty to the throne had withered since the death of Lord Virelius. It was then that the keeper, unprompted, placed a second piece of intelligence into the emperor's hand, a copy of the letter, intercepted and transcribed before the original was ever delivered. Its words so spare, they were almost a riddle, The crown is not his to offer, but yours to take. The emperor read it twice, his jaw tightening, for it was not merely a threat, but an invitation. And the most galling truth was that he could not tell whether the spider at the web's center meant to catch him, the heir, or both. On the morning of the 5th day, the heir made his move not with swords or proclamations, but with a gesture so carefully wrapped in the silk of tradition that to challenge it outright would have been to risk appearing the enemy of custom itself. He rode into the capital at the head of a small procession, no more than 24 horsemen, all unarmed save for ceremonial blades, and made straight for the Temple of Ancestors, the most sacred site in the city, where every ruler for 3 centuries had gone to offer tribute before the great altar of the founding emperor. The custom was ancient, but its meaning was clear. To stand there, beneath the colonnade carved with the empire's history, was to be seen as a rightful claimant to its legacy, whether as reigning sovereign or as heir apparent, and the heir performed the rites with a precision that would have impressed the most conservative priest. The people crowded the temple steps, murmuring blessings and bowing their heads. For to the common eye, there was little difference between honoring an heir and honoring a ruler. And by the time the emperor learned of it, the deed was already done. Its image burned into the minds of thousands. In the palace council that afternoon, the marshal of the southern legions openly questioned whether such a public display of legitimacy could have taken place without the emperor's consent, his voice loud enough for the scribes to hear and record, while the minister of coin, feigning concern, suggested that perhaps it was time to make the heir status official to calm the unrest. The emperor kept his face as still as marble, but inside he felt the ground shift beneath him, for the alliance he had crafted in secrecy was now a matter of public spectacle, and the city had begun to treat the heir not as the sword at the emperor's side, but as the shadow already stretching over his throne. By nightfall, the emperor had resolved to reclaim the narrative. Before the heir's theater became prophecy, his plan was swift and brutal in its elegance. Summon the Senate to an emergency convocation at dawn, present a decree affirming the heir's loyalty, and bind it with a ritual oath sworn before the gods and the city. In such a setting, refusal would be political suicide, and agreement would make any future challenge appear as betrayal. But politics, like war, rarely moves in neat lines, and before the palace heralds could even deliver the summons, word arrived of a riot in the southern quarter, a market district infamous for its poverty and its volatile loyalty. The banners raised there were not of the heir nor of the emperor, but of the old house Verentes, a dynasty extinguished to generations past, whose claim to the throne had been buried under years of blood and law. The rioters, drunk on some dangerous cocktail of nostalgia and coin, stormed the tax offices and drove the collectors into the river, chanting the names of dead princes as though calling them back to life. The palace guard urged the emperor to respond with steel, but the keeper of the night counseled caution, whispering that the riot bore the mark of orchestration, a feint to draw imperial attention away from the heart of the city. Sure enough, while the guard mustered in the south, messengers came running from the northern gates, reporting that the heir's companions, those western merchants and their hired men, had been seen entering the city in far greater numbers than his ceremonial escort. By the time the emperor ordered the gates sealed, the reinforcements had already vanished into the twisting alleys, their loyalty unknown, their purpose unspoken, but their presence a seed of unease that would bloom in every corner of the capital. Before the sun rose again, the morning broke with a sky the color of tarnished bronze, heavy with the promise of a storm, and the emperor awoke to the sound of muffled shouting in the outer courtyard. His spy master, a gaunt man who seemed to subsist entirely on rumor and black tea, arrived with the news before the servants could light the first lamps. The riots in the southern quarter had not sprung from some latent Verentes loyalty at all, but from the coin purses of the Merchant Guild of Rest, a shadowy consortium whose caravan stretched from the salt flats of the east to the ports of the western sea. Their interests had been threatened when the emperor raised tariffs to fund his border garrisons, and they had found in the air a far more pliable partner. The Verentes banners, it turned out, had been nothing more than purchase theater, a smokescreen meant to invoke old romantic loyalties while the guild's agents smuggled armed men and supplies through the city's veins. Worse still, the spymaster revealed that the leader of the rest delegation was none other than Calvin Dorr, a man the emperor had once trusted as a negotiator in peace talks, whose silver tongue had ended wars and opened markets, and who now seemed intent on ending a reign. In the Great Hall, the Emperor's council fractured along predictable lines. The war faction demanded immediate arrests and public executions, while the moderates warned that moving against the heir and the guild without irrefutable proof would make the Emperor appear a tyrant strangling commerce. The Emperor listened, his gaze fixed on the storm-dark horizon, knowing that the enemy's true genius lay not in the riots or the infiltrations, but in the careful weaving of rebellion and legitimacy into the same banner, a banner that the people might soon rally to without ever realizing they had chosen treason over loyalty. By mid-afternoon, the city was a drumbeat of tension, every alley whispering with rumor, every marketplace pausing in its trade to glance toward the palace gates. The Emperor, worn but unbroken, gathered his resolve for a final move that would either cement his rule or see his blood on the marble. He summoned both of the Senate and the Guild's representatives under the pretext of a public reconciliation, announcing the meeting in the forum so the entire capital might witness it. When they assembled, the air was thick with suspicion. The heir seated proudly at the Guild's side, Calvin Dorr wearing the smug smile of a man who believed the game already won. But before any words were spoken, the Emperor's guards sealed the forum entrances, and from the shadows emerged witnesses, merchants bribed to incite the riots, soldiers who had escorted contraband through the gates, clerks who had falsified trade records, they all now willing to testify in exchange for clemency. The revelations fell like hammer blows, stripping the guild of its facade of legitimacy and exposing the heir's complicity for all to see. Gasps turned to shouts, shouts to cries for justice, and the tide shifted in the Emperor's favor. Yet as the guards moved to seize the conspirators, the heir rose, staring at his uncle with a defiance that was almost pity. 7 days, he said, voice carrying over the crowd. That's all history will remember. And in that moment the Emperor understood the truth. Though his throne might endure beyond sunset, the story of his reign would forever be defined not by victories or decrees, but by the week his crown had trembled. He gave the order to take them away, the storm finally breaking overhead, rain mingling with the cheers and curses of the people, a city cleansed, for now, but never truly at peace.